I moved to a quiet town because I wanted less noise. I wanted trees instead of traffic lights, neighbors who nodded instead of neighbors who yelled, a sky you could read. What I didn't expect was how much the woods would read me back, how loud silence could become, and how much ordinary things could hide. If you like real horror stories, hit subscribe and stay for the rest. I wasn't some weekend warrior. I grew up on trails and campsites. When I was younger, the woods felt honest. There was a logic to them. Follow the stream, cross at the fallen birch, avoid the cliff ledge. You learned how to read signs. That confidence carried me through the first years living in that small rural town, until the woods started giving me signals I didn't understand. The town was the sort of place with one diner, one general store, and a sheriff's office that never closed its blinds. I took a part-time job, stacking wood and cleaning pumps at a gas and donut place on the edge of town. It kept me outdoors, gave me cash, and left my evenings free to hike. People in town were the kind who knew your name without social media and who'd point out a stranger in town 3 minutes after they arrived. That mix of visibility and isolation is what I trusted, the idea that someone out there would notice if I went missing. I learned later how wrong that trust can be. He was small and a little too strong-looking for his size. He moved like a kid skipping through a field, light on his feet, a jerking hop step that should have been almost playful if it wasn't so wrong in the woods. He wore a knitted cap, like someone had pulled it from the same thrift bin as his jacket. The first time I saw him, it was across the highway, by the hardware store, stacking an odd pile of rocks by the curb. He looked up, saw I was watching, and smiled. It should have been friendly. It wasn't. People here had habits. They mowed at dawn. They left jars of cookies on stoops. They also sometimes talked to themselves. You notice oddities in a small town and then file them under eccentric neighbor and move on. That was my first mistake with him. I started filing away moments instead of asking questions. I began seeing him in places you wouldn't expect him to be. On trailheads at dawn, crouched by fallen trees where no trail went, at the back of the grocery store long after the lights were dimmed. He wasn't always alone. Sometimes he muttered, and from that mutter, you'd catch the flash of two voices inside him, one small and pleading, one closer to a shout. Once, in broad daylight on the edge of a meadow, he turned his head and very clearly said to no one, "Go away. I'm trying to sleep." Then a second voice, rougher, answered, "You can't sleep there." I told myself it was nothing. People talk in voices to themselves when there's no one to talk to. But the woods recorded things differently. A sound there doesn't live in one place. It moves between trunks, bounces off rock faces, hides in the hush. One afternoon, I decided to go farther than usual, the way you do when you've been thinking too much and need a little more distance between yourself and your own head. It was late summer, and the canopy kept the heat pressed down into humidity. The trail narrowed and eventually caved into scrub and then into old logging paths that even the deer used sparingly. That's when I heard the voices. At first I couldn't tell where they were. Two tones overlaying each other, like someone playing a broken tape at two speeds. One voice was almost childish, soft, asking. The other was sharp and irritable, punctuated by single-word bursts. "Leave! Now! Do it!" They were close enough that I felt the vibration in my ribs. Whoever was speaking wasn't very far. I froze. You learn to listen in the woods. The big things, bears, loose dogs, make predictable noises. This wasn't predictable. This pressed at you from everywhere and nowhere. I called out a dumb, "Hello?" because sometimes that diffuses a tense unknown. One of the voices answered in a squeal and then switched, like flipping a radio dial. Suddenly, a man was standing 3 yards off the trail. Hector. He saw me, and then he didn't. His eyes slid past me as if looking through the tree line into a different private conversation. "Come outside, Artie," he said. He didn't know my name. I didn't know his, but those words, "come outside," carried a tone that wasn't a request. It was a command layered with a game I didn't agree to play. The pleading voice answered inside him, "Please, don't." And then the sharp one shoved itself forward. "Not your place." The voice switching wasn't dramatic. It was a micro-switch, a physical movement, a set of lips pulling, a throat yielding. The man, if he was a man, walked toward me, skipping once like he'd forgotten to keep his balance. That graceful hop became a staccato of motion as he drew closer. When he was within reaching distance, his face rearranged, like a mask shifting. "Why you here?" the angry voice snapped. I stepped back. My pack scraped the brush, and in his eyes something shifted to recognition, not of me, but of trespass. He lunged, not with a full sprint, but with an efficient, terrifying calculation. He didn't shout a plan, he screamed. The scream was not a human scream as much as a tearing of fabric. It was sound shaped like panic. He screamed in my face, things I didn't need to hear, and at a decibel that made my ears ring. "You shouldn't be here," he screamed, then moved like a small animal after a broken path. His nimbleness turned what could have been clumsy into a hunting precision. I ran. The first 20 yards made a reckless laugh in my throat, because when you run out of a wild thing, part of you thinks this is a story you'll retell later, a tale told around a highway fire pit. The second 20 yards compiled into a different sensation. Branches swatting my face, boots slipping on a bed of dead leaves, that taut internal voice counting steps and breath. He was behind me and not behind me, in the same way you can feel a hot wind on the back of your neck without a visible fire. There was noise, a lighter snap of footfalls, the occasional guttural sound from his mouth. I don't know how far I ran. The world reduced to breath and the smell of crushed pine. At one point I hit a slope, and my left boot slid and I skidded, scraping my knee. The pain sharpened my mind. I swung up and kept going. The woods narrowed, the sky thinned into silver strip. I could have veered off unpredictably to throw him, and maybe that would have worked. But something older in me denied the long odds of turning a chase into heroics. I wanted to be where someone would notice. I wanted a road, a house, a light. When the trees opened, there was a service road, 2 ruts through grass leading to the back of an old farmhouse. A pickup truck was parked there with a busted tail light. When I burst into that clearing, Hector was already there. He stopped on the other side of the truck, breathing hard, and for a half-second, the 2 voices in him had calmed into a static hum. He looked at me and tilted his head sideways like a confused dog. "You're not from here," the pleading voice said softly. The angry one whispered, "He saw too much." I told the sheriff. I told him the entire thing, every hop, every voice. He listened without expression, which is why the expression he wore when he finally spoke mattered. It was pale and small, as though the cold had taken his color. He asked where the chase ended. When I described the back of the farmhouse and the broken taillight, his face went slack in a way I remember to this day. He wrote something down and then said the stupidest sentence, "That's the place." He told me, after a long, silent minute, that years before a local man had been found in a remote grave nearby. They'd never identified everything about the case. They never had a name, never made an arrest. All I can tell you is that when he said the shovel had been found, when he said the area matched the coordinates of that spot, there was a weight added to the sound of the woods that wasn't there before. I hadn't tripped into a folklore tale. I had walked into a marked place, on a map only he didn't want to mention at the counter. The sheriff's jaw tightened. He asked questions I didn't have answers to. How long had I been in town? Had I seen similar people before? But when he asked whether Hector had been seen by others, I realized I only had myself. People in town knew of Hector in the way you know of an old dog. Tolerated. The sheriff told me to stay reachable, and he promised to drive by the area. He did not tell me if they found anything. They didn't call me in the night with news. Whether that was negligence or procedure or something else, I don't know. Hector disappeared that day. I never saw the skip again. The two voices, the rearranged expression. People later offered me half answers. He moved away, or you saw someone passing through. None of those explanations fit the weight lodged in the back of my neck after I left the woods. The thing that stayed most with me wasn't the hunt itself, but how ordinary the man had seemed before the hunt began. He could have been anyone's father or brother. He could have been one of the gentler eccentrics who refill the town's hummingbird feeders. The woods taught me then that familiarity is a thin membrane, and sometimes it tears. That was only the beginning. We tried to treat it like a bad dream. I hiked less alone. I checked my phone's battery. I made pretense of normality to satisfy the neighbors. But when my girlfriend Katie and I planned a multi-day backpacking trip in upstate New York, an easy mapped trail with river crossings and a place to fish, we thought a change of scenery would help. Katie grew up in cities and liked the woods the way people like their neighbors, at a comfortable distance but full of character. She was practical, decisive, and the sort of person who could laugh a night of rain into a cooking story. That combination is what made the next stretch worse. Her presence made the woods personal again. We'd been together 3 years. We argued about small things and made up with coffee. On the first night of the hike, we set up the tent on a flat shoulder by a sluggish creek. The dusk was heavy with midsummer smell. Wet leaves, a faint rot of mushrooms, the oily scent of river water. We had a small stove, a can of beans, the ritual of unzipping into the world and settling into being two people inside a canvas box. Sound felt benign. Tree insects, distant bird calls, the river's slow speech. Some time after midnight, Katie sat up and said, "Do you hear that?" Her voice was the low kind that asks something tentative, the kind that lets curiosity out without alarm. I did. At first it was a giggle, like two children sharing a secret. Twice, high and thin, then silence swallowed it as if it had never been. We lay still, and the tent's thin fabric magnified the moderations of the night. We laughed nervously. "Camp prank," I said. "Someone from another site. Kids." But the giggling came back, and it wasn't random anymore. It arranged itself in a pattern, circling the camp like a moth irritated at the light. Every so often there'd be a whisper that sounded like breath against canvas, and then a bright, childlike scolding, "Shh, shh." Sometimes it was nothing, some fox in mating season maybe, but then there was a call that tore the edges off that easiest explanation. "Artie!" It wasn't a voice calling from the trail. It didn't come from a distance that made sense. It came from near the tree line, but with an intimacy that suggested the person at the edge of the wood could have been inside our tent at any moment. It called my name as if it had been memorized. Katie's hand found my forearm. Her fingers were tight enough to bruise. We didn't respond. We didn't want to show we were afraid. The call came again, clipped and close. "Artie." The next morning, the campsite looked like something had been studying us overnight. Rocks were arranged around our fire pit, small stones, stacked into uneven columns, circling the ashes like a crown. There were tied sticks, little bundles with expended things tied into them, a bit of a thread, a wildflower's head, 2 short lengths of red string, knotted in patterns we'd seen in no craft book. It wasn't childish clutter. The circles had intention. They were deliberate. When we asked other hikers later, we were told this had happened in other places, anecdotes exchanged like nicknames. "People make cairns," an old woman at the ranger's kiosk said. "Kids leave them." But these weren't simple cairns. They were too careful, too repeated. Someone walked in slow circles around our life while we slept and left a message they didn't bother to sign. We could have shrugged and kept going. Anyone who has camped knows you sometimes pick up strange things and keep walking. It becomes an odd souvenir. But on the second night, the behavior escalated. The river had gone quiet from the daytime dance of frogs, and now the forest sounded like someone had muted the world. We slept lighter. We zipped the tent up fully, used the small flashlight to check the perimeter, and left the stove inside the vestibule so no smell could lure nocturnal scavengers. At around 2 in the morning, something brushed the outer seam of our tent. It was not a breeze. It was precise, like a fingertip dragging across nylon. A shadow moved outside. Then a shape stopped and stood upright and impossibly smiled. She wore white. Not a modern dress, not even a coat that could pass for white. It hung from a certain silhouette that made it look like someone had stepped out of faded photographs. She stood by the tent's zipper and raised her hand in a small, almost demure wave. For a moment, simple electricity ran through my body and wrote the name of an old movie in the margins of my thoughts. But this wasn't a movie. Her smile didn't reach her eyes. "Hey," I whispered. "Who's there?" She didn't speak. She lifted her chin as if to say, "I've been waiting." My tongue stuck in my mouth for the longest time, because regardless of what else you have, the image of a person standing that close, staring at you with a flat smile, rearranges priorities. Katie pulled the sleeping bag up, leaving only our faces visible. The smile remained. She took one step back and was gone. Not buried by darkness, evaporated as if someone had pressed a button and she slid off the world. There was no rustle, no step, no disturbed brush. 1 second, shape. Next second, empty air. We unzipped the tent and shone a flashlight into the trees. The beams cut through nothing. There were no footprints. The grass near our site was unbroken, as if whatever had come had never touched ground. We slept in our clothes that night. We packed quickly at dawn, jittery, moving with the efficiency of people who have been shown the edges of their safety. At the head of the creek, more stones, stacked, arranged into tiny altars, string tied around saplings. The word leave wasn't anywhere spelled in letters, but the arrangement had a punctuation that felt like a sentence. Stop. Driving back into town, the radio sounded foolish and small. We had the rational answers: pranksters, local kids, the forest playing tricks. We called the local ranger, who shrugged and said people play games in the woods. The Net had claimed similar complaints in the past. No one could tell us the identity of the white-dressed woman. No one had a plausible explanation for why the stones had been arranged specifically around our site. A shake of our shoulders wasn't enough. We swore we were done, but that didn't immediately change the sense of eyes on the back of your neck. It doesn't matter how many friends you have in town or how often you go into a diner. The woods keep their own hours and their own watchers. You can be surrounded by people and still be privately terrifying. That night, as we sat in my living room back in town, Katie's face took on the kind of grave patience that makes you know someone has carried a thought the whole time. She told me that when she had been a kid, her mother had warned her about getting too curious in certain places, about leaving offerings or taking stones. "It was nonsense," she said. "But it's the kind of nonsense that scrapes at your skin when things happen." We thought about going back, about following the pattern to find the person or people who had made that night into something ritual. We thought about not going back at all. We thought about how superstition, once it clicks into your life, begins to map choices and routes it hadn't owned before. We argued quietly, and then didn't argue at all, because arguing felt like wasting time on something that might not be negotiable. Sometimes you have to choose skepticism or survival, and we both chose survival. We told ourselves we would never camp that route again. But there are moments the mind stores, like a stone. Months later I'll be in the grocery store, and some child will hum a tune, and I will think of the way the woman in white smiled and then dissolved into night. Those kinds of images don't vanish with distance. They rearrange your expectations. You begin to notice small things, how some people avoid your eye, how some trails always seem to go a half-mile farther than the maps say. You start to believe the woods have memory. When I look back, the thread that runs between Hector and the woman in white and the other things I will tell you is this. The woods blur the lines between people who are problem and people who are mystery. They hide patterns until you trip into them. They make you question whether fear is reaction or revelation. We hadn't yet learned that lesson fully. We were cautious after the white dress, jittery and watchful, but normal routines have gravity. A few months later, I was back on a trail with two old friends, Theo and Carlos, and we were the kind of people who liked the challenge of finding things other folks overlooked. We'd done it since we were kids, scaled derelict barns, found old wells, looted forgotten fishing spots for rusty hooks. We liked the narrative of discovery and the way a group could make a place feel less heavy. This time, word on the street was the cabin. People said there was an abandoned cabin out past the ridge that used to belong to a man no one remembered. It had been boarded up, but the boards were rotten, the roof saggy. It wasn't on any map. That made it irresistible. We set out on a bright morning with packs, a thermos, and an exaggerated sense of confidence. The hike cut across a tuft of new growth, then into older pines. There was a smell, at first, of sap and dry needles, and the kind of waspy sweetness that comes from flowering sumac. The cabin sat below the ridge, in a fold of land that made it seem smaller than it probably was. From the outside, it looked like a child's model left out in the rain, leaning with a porch that had given up on supporting itself. We went around back. The planks of the porch sagged alarmingly beneath our boots. Next to the cabin, a lean-to collapsed inward. The grass at the edge was patchy and trampled, a recent footprint pressed in the mud. That should have been the first sign. We told ourselves the obvious: vagrants, teenagers smoking weed, a trap for curious photographers. You tell yourself stories like that so you can continue. Theo found the hatch. It was tucked under the rotten floorboards inside the cabin, a trap door with a rusted handle and a ladder folded beneath it. The smell came first from the open hatch before the light did, a thick metallic trace, like iron left out in the rain. Something else threaded in. Old damp. Something that could be someone's breath after a long fever. We all hesitated in a way animals do before descending into holes. Our group joke flattened and left a blank. Carlos, the pragmatic one, went first. He lowered the ladder and shimmied down with a flashlight in his teeth, his hands steady on rust-bitten rungs. Theo followed close after, younger and more impulsive, the sort who thinks danger is merely a speed bump. I went last, surveying the cabin for signs, the way a fool would check for traps in a fairy story. Underneath the cabin, the room was smaller than we'd expected. Dirt floor, a single crate against the far wall. The ladder's metal breathed under my weight. The air was cold in a way the surface wasn't, and that cold carried a smell that had no name in my vocabulary. It was the difference between a dead thing and the leftover idea of a dead thing. In the corner, something moved. At first it was a pair of legs. They were limpid, draped in a pant leg and a boot that had lost half its sole. Then the rest of the man slid into sight. He was thin, with a stick-thin gait, dragging his right foot like a rusted hinge. He moved with an awkward, uneven step, like he'd been taught to walk wrong. His mouth muttered something in a language I didn't recognize. Soft syllables that wove through the dank air. He didn't scream. He didn't curse. He stared, and the stare wasn't a glare, but a blank. When he looked at us, his eyes didn't search for recognition. They hovered like a window that hadn't been wiped clean in a long time. We had nothing to say. Theo's laugh leapt out before he could swallow it. Stupidity and adrenaline make water boil quickly. "Hey," Theo said, grinning like a man announcing a joke. "You okay, man?" The limping man looked at us as if we were a new idea he had no use for. He mumbled, his lips working, and the words were not English. They were rhythmic and ancient-sounding, like a nursery song from a country where air moves differently. He took one step toward the ladder and stopped. He watched each of us climb back up with an intensity that felt like being measured for something we hadn't wanted to wear. We left. We didn't talk for the first half-mile out. The practical, loud parts of us had fled and left a quieter, more watchful core behind. The man had not moved as we climbed, not until we were halfway back to the light. And then when we glanced backward, the hatch was closed. The cabin looked like any abandoned building again, its secrets folded tight. That night, in the cheap diner a town over, we told the sheriff. He came slow, hair out of place, and listened to our story with a face that could read suspicion like a ledger. He went with us back the next day. We showed him the place. The hatch was closed, the ladder gone. There were no clear prints in the mud near the entrance. The place that had felt full of presence was suddenly tidy in its abandonment. We told him how the man had limped and how he had spoken a language none of us understood. We asked how someone could be there and then disappear. The sheriff rubbed the bridge of his nose. "We didn't find any evidence anyone had been living there," he said. "No bedding, nothing that would suggest long-term habitation. Most of these places get used occasionally, but the lack of signs is odd." Odd was a soft word. We had had a living, breathing person in the underfloor room, and now there was nothing, no clothing left behind, no sign of fresh food, no bottles, no cigarette butts, nothing to indicate a camp. In the sheriff's ledger, that became a puzzling blank entry. We left the cabin with something more complicated than fear, an adult's kind of guilt. Did we leave something it would have been kinder to change? Had we, in that moment of discovery, been voyeuristic? Did we have a responsibility to help someone who seemed in need? The questions looped. We were young enough to imagine ourselves heroic, and old enough to know heroics carry consequences. We told other people. Their reactions ranged from scoffing to concern. A neighbor who had been in law enforcement for 40 years told us stories of people who walked out of such holes and never explained where they'd gone. "Sometimes they move on," he said, and shrugged. But the shrug never quite settled me. I went home that night and took a long shower until the water cooled. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the limping man at the ladder, his lifeless stare, and the way his feet scraped on the lower rung, as if the ladder was the only tether he had to the visible world. The memory had a quality that made me feel like I had been rude to some antiquated etiquette. We had stared at someone else's poverty of movement and then left without an offering. Back then I thought fear was a thing that could be confined to a trail, a single camp. I was wrong. Fear spreads. It writes its own map across your life and adds markers in places you thought belonged to ease. The woods teach you to catalogue danger in ways you can't always admit. The limping man, the woman in white, Hector, they all folded into that catalogue and rearranged the lines. You stop being the same person who walks into the green. And yet, as much as all these events pushed me away from the forest, they pushed me towards stories. People who survive strange things tell them again and again in an attempt to make sense, sometimes to themselves, sometimes to warn someone else. What I can offer you are honest reports, what I heard, what I saw, what was said in pale light. There are parts of these accounts I wish I could unknow. There are more stories I haven't told you yet, things that will make the hairs on your arms plant their own trees. But these early scratches on the map were the ones that taught me something essential. The woods do not keep only what they collect in their brushes and hollows. They keep who sees them. We learned afterward to leave markers. Note the time, tell friends, take a photo. You do mundane things to push back the unexplainable. You do them because once you've felt watched where no one should be watching, the default becomes suspicion. We kept living, kept hiking, because the alternative, never living fully again, was worse. Still, when I would walk at dusk, the memory of someone calling my name in a voice that should not have been there made me check over my shoulder. A pattern started to form in my head. It wasn't neat, it wasn't useful for solving mysteries, but it told a story about edges, people who live on the margins. Hector at the road, the woman at the tent, the limping man under the cabin. People who are both visible and invisible at once. People who make you reconsider what you thought you knew about neighborly boundaries. As the months wore on, the edges thinned and thickened at the same time. The town continued to operate on its predictable hourly loop. Farmers mowed. The diner served breakfast. Kids rode their bikes down bakery alleys. But the woods around the town tightened their folds. They were the same swathe of green, but my sense of them had changed. Every hollow had a memory now. Every creak sounded like a throat clearing. I didn't stop going in. I wanted to understand, maybe as much for myself as to protect the people I cared about. I worried about Katie less than I worried about the idea of being surprised again. You think you can inoculate yourself with knowledge, read the right forums, check in with law enforcement, avoid eccentric strangers, but knowledge is not armor. It is, at best, a map that shows you where the cliffs used to be. At a little after midnight on a late fall night, I found myself walking along a trail in the state forest by myself. The air had that sourness only autumn can produce. Rotting leaves and wood smoke from other people's fires. I had made the mistake of thinking that cold makes things more ordinary. The opposite was true. The cold lengthened sounds, made footsteps louder and voices thinner. It made whatever was wrong feel more sharp. A twig snapped a dozen yards behind me. Not a deer, not a predictable animal, something that moved with purpose. My breath grew shallow. I thought briefly of Hector and the way his voices split. I thought of the woman smiling at a tent zipper. The sound was close, too close. I turned and saw a figure step between two trunks. It was small, crouched and then rising. The outline was wrong, too proportionate in one way and completely off in another. It wore what might have been a hood, but could have just been a shadow. It made no noise as it moved. It had no face in a moment that meant everything. I didn't run. Not because I was brave, more because the muscles in my legs had been tuned to old trauma. I remember the sensation of walking toward the figure like someone going toward a train wreck, slow, cataloguing, unable to make choices that felt safe. For a second the woods hummed with the usual noises, the creak of wind, the distant highway. But those noises felt like a stage set to a theater that had suddenly gotten serious. The figure spoke, not my name, not a word I recognized, something like a prayer or a practice. The sound scraped at the back of my teeth. Then it was gone. I stood there and tried to tell myself why this moment wasn't enough to change the arc of my life. You learn to rationalize. You say this was a dream, or a trick of light, or some town eccentric moved out into the forest with a sermon. But whenever I think about being alone and hearing something speak in a tone that meant it had been rehearsed a long time without an audience, I feel my skin lift with gooseflesh. There are things in the woods that don't have your best interests in mind. By then, my notebook was full of small entries, dates, times, oddities. It was as close to evidence as I could get. I started to share those notes with others, friends, the sheriff, in one case an academic who liked folklore. They all offered something, curiosity, sympathy, a suggestion to seek therapy if I was having trouble sleeping. No one gave me a tidy explanation. I don't want you to think I was any kind of hero through all of this. I did dumb things. I left doors open out of habit. I engaged with people I shouldn't have. But I also tried to keep track of patterns. Single instances are accidents. Patterns are warnings. What matters is that the woods continued to collect people and behaviors that made nightly life feel less domestic. Those small, incremental erosions of safety were the worst thing of all. You can adapt to sudden terror. You have a fight-or-flight script that works. It's pre-programmed. But slow, steady erosion, small knocks at your tent, stones arranged like punctuation, a man who can switch voices as if changing hats, reworks your nervous system into being cautious in a way that is exhausting and permanent. When I look back on that period, on the way my apartment smelled like old coffee and anxiety, on the way every clearing felt momentarily like a page turned in a book with missing lines, I see a simple miscalculation we all make. We assume that because something is local, because it is nearby, we can control it somehow. We assume we are safe because we see the edges of our life. The woods taught me that some edges are illusions. There are more stories. There are details I haven't told you, ones that make the hairs on my arms stand up and make me check locks twice. But this is where I will leave it for now, at a place where story begins to feel like a list of small betrayals by ordinary things. The next part of what I have to tell you involves friends, a different kind of discovery, and the feeling of having a choice and not taking it. It became the hardest thing to live with afterward, the knowledge of what we left behind. We didn't talk about it much at first, not because we couldn't, because every sentence felt like a verdict. The three of us sat in that diner like men who had read something terrible in the classifieds and didn't know if they should call the number. Theo joked too loud, trying to fill the silence with the sound of a person who assumed sound could fix anything. Carlos chewed his toast like he was making a decision about whether to swallow the guilt or spit it out. I kept staring at the coffee cup until it went cold. We all wanted to make the right choice. We wanted to go back and help, to find out if that limping man needed a warm blanket or a ride to the hospital. But we also kept hearing that mumbled language in our heads, seeing the way his feet scraped the ladder, watching him blink like something deciding whether it wanted to be looked at. There was no clean moral move. Every option had a cost. So we did the most cowardly, complicated thing a group of friends can do. We argued about what courage looked like, and then drifted apart until inertia took over. Theo drank more. Carlos started staying later at work, avoiding the routes that took him past the ridge. I took to hiking at times when the light was worst for other people, dawn and the violet moment right before dusk, because there was a stupid comfort in being one of the first to see the light change. One of the people who could claim the forest before it noticed you noticing it back. The limping man's face crept into dreams, the way a melody finds its way into an old ringtone you don't use anymore. Sometimes it was a flash, a pale face at the edge of a picture. Sometimes it was the whole scene, so vivid I could smell the cold air under the cabin and taste the iron in the room. When I woke, I would lie very still, trying to decide whether to call someone or pretend I hadn't been near the edge of panic. Mostly I pretended. Months later, the three of us met again on purpose. Not to solve anything, we weren't sainted enough for that, but because the weight of silence was heavier than the weight of the memory. We agreed to go back to the cabin in the middle of the day, to bring older, braver eyes and a camera this time. If nothing else, we wanted to prove to ourselves what the sheriff had said, that sometimes the woods clean themselves up after you pry into their business. The approach was stupidly easy. The trail folded into the same hollow. The cabin squatted where it had always squatted, shingles caved in like sighs. The hatch was closed. There was a neatness to how the place presented itself now, like a house that didn't want to be known for what it might have hidden. The ladder was gone. There were no impressions in the mud that read like a recent footprint. Sun-carved shadows across the porch slats, and a chickadee made a nest in one of the eaves. We walked around the perimeter. We called out names in high, mocking voices. We prodded the door with a stick until it sighed and opened to a black mouth. No sound came from under the floor. Dust motes swam in the new light. The crate against the far wall lay snug and sealed like a secret the house had had time to decide not to give. Theo tapped the wood with his knuckles. It made a hollow note. We all did it. The sound fell into the same place the sheriff's words had fallen. No evidence anyone had been living there. Language bureaucrat words for a real ugly thing we'd seen. We left without taking a single action that could be labeled good. No call to a shelter, no leaving of supplies, no attempt to find out more about the property or the people who owned it. We departed with the same shame as apathetic witnesses. We'd seen a thing and chosen the safer sin, convenience. That night Theo called me at 2 a.m. He'd had a few beers and been driving home alone, and the road had seemed longer than usual. He didn't speak at first, just made sounds that didn't line up into words. When he finally said something, it was the strangest confession. "I keep hearing him," Theo said. "Sometimes when I'm half asleep at work, I can hear that language. I think he said something. I can't place the rhythm. It's like a song I almost know." He started humming whenever he thought we weren't listening, a low syllable that matched the cadence I remembered under the cabin. Carlos denied hearing anything when I told him, but he avoided parked cars with boarded windows. He stopped going on our long hikes. When we met, he kept his eyes at the horizon, as if someone there might be tracing his outline. You begin to catalogue survival the wrong way. You count your choices, like coins you can spend at a market you never leave. Every unspent gesture turns into a small remorse you carry in your pocket. That pocket grows heavy. We tried to turn the experience into something useful. For a while, we made a ritual of reporting. We made calls to the sheriff's office. We wrote emails to the Forest Service. We filled out online forms. Someone from a local shelter said they had no records that matched what we described. Someone at the ranger kiosk gave us the same half-answer. Abandoned cabins get used and unused in cycles. The sheriff, narrow-jawed and practical, told us again that there was nothing in their logs to suggest someone had been living there long-term. You can accept that, or you can let it make you a repository for unanswered questions. I became the latter. I started to write the odd details down, obsessively, the way the limping man dragged his foot, the sound of his muttering, the exact pattern of the stacked rocks at Katie's campsite. My notebook turned into a ledger of unease. I labeled it Notes, because giving fear a formal name is a way of pretending you have a chart you can read. It doesn't help much. The ledger is an anchor, not a compass. It grounds you in certain facts. The date you were called by name, the smell under that hatch, the way Hector's voice is switched, but it doesn't tire the restlessness. It doesn't silence the little internal bell that rings whenever a twig snaps too close behind you. People will tell you to go back to heal. Closure, they say, as if closure is a place you can drive to and pick up. But the woods rarely hand you closure on a platter. Sometimes you find a thing that explains everything. More often, you find nothing, and the knowledge of nothing becomes its own kind of haunting. That's the real terror, I think. Not that something evil lurks behind the trees, but that the woods can turn ordinary people into mysteries for each other. Hector was a man downtown, stacking rocks, smiling in a way that should have been benign. The woman in white was someone who stood outside a zipper and smiled. The limping man lived under a floor like a thought nobody wanted to entertain. Each of them was, in their own way, visible and invisible at once. What trouble comes when the borders of visibility shift, when the person you pass every day can become a locus for a danger you didn't imagine? I can't say whether any of those people were suffering from illness or performing a ritual I didn't understand, or were embodiments of something older that gets unnoticed until the living step into it. I only know the facts that happened to me, how my name sounded when it wasn't spoken by someone I knew, how rocks can be arranged into sentences, how a ladder can hold a weight that disappears. Those things are true in my life, and they made me change where I walk and who I trust. After the cabin, things changed between us. Theo stopped going on long trips. He started sleeping with a light on. Carlos moved to a different shift at work and told us he needed time to sort things out. We saw each other sometimes, shared beers, and the easy humor we had once used as scaffolding, but there were pauses now that had the weight of doors being tested. I felt the same way, like a man whose hands once fit around a doorframe but now meet a different texture. We learned to carry maps and batteries and a standard list. Tell someone where you're going, set a check-in time, bring a radio if possible. These are the small acts you take to manufacture a sense of safety. They don't erase the memory of a man at the ladder or the woman who smiled and vanished. They make you slightly less likely to be an unpaid witness to someone else's ruin. Months turned into years. The episodes didn't stop completely. There are things that have a long half-life in my mind, but they became a less immediate ache and more like an old scar you forget until you brush it and it stings. Hector's skipping gait echoed in the odd people you meet downtown sometimes. The woman in white became a shorthand for the small, ritualized ways people mark a place as not for you. The limping man resided in my head as a reminder that there are layers of presence under the things we walk upon. Every so often, someone would approach me at a trailhead or message me online. I got notes that said pretty directly, "I was there too." Others were more oblique, a picture of a ring of stones taken by a camper 2 towns over, or a voicemail from a woman who said she woke up to someone humming her dead grandfather's song. Each of those messages reopened the ledger. You never want to be the person whose story is a pattern, but patterns are how you see through the fog. What keeps me up sometimes is not just the memory, but the question of responsibility. If we had stayed at the cabin and called more people, if we'd camped elsewhere with Katie and confronted whatever made those circles of stone, would anything have been different? Or would we have been part of an escalation we couldn't have imagined? It's easy to load oneself with the weight of if only. Niece, it's heavier to live with the knowledge that sometimes your choices are between bad things rather than between good and bad. That is why these stories haunt. They are not tidy. They don't come with villains you can name and put behind town ordinances. They come with faces and actions, and then the stubborn refusal of the world to give you a conclusion. The woods keep their pages without footnotes. If there's a lesson in all of it, if a lesson can be drawn from a ledger of small, sharp incidents, it's this. Respect the fact that the world holds more than your comfortable explanations. That doesn't mean you should stop going outside or stop trusting people. It means you carry a different kind of attention. You tell someone where you're headed. You bring a charged phone and a headlamp. You travel with friends. You listen for patterns. Not because you're a conspiracy theorist, but because pattern recognition keeps you alive. I still go out alone sometimes. The urge to see what is beyond the next ridge is stubborn. It lives in the same place that taught me how to read a trail when I was 6, and my father taught me to tie a proper knot, but I go with more caution now and less illusion about how much control I have. There are limits to what maps can tell you, and you learn to be comfortable with that discomfort, or at least to make peace with checking in when you shouldn't have to. These 3 stories, Hector by the highway, the woman who smiled outside our tent, and the limping man under the cabin, line up in my head like stones. Each one is a small monument to how easily ordinary life can tilt into something you don't recognize. They are true. They happened. They have changed me and the people I care about in ways I still catalogue. So if you've got a story from the deep woods, if you woke up to giggling outside your tent, if a stranger called you by a name they shouldn't have known, if you found a space under a house you didn't want to look under, put it in the comments. Tell it plainly. We're all making this map together, whether we like it or not. If you want more accounts like these, or you want me to share other nights that taught me how easily a trail can become a question, like and subscribe. And please, if you go out this weekend, tell someone where you're going. A little caution keeps the woods from being the only thing that remembers you.